Martin Luther King, force for good or force for bad for black people and American culture?
Force for bad. Total force for bad. Because what the civil rights movement did is it turned black people into a protected class. And that was the worst thing that I think could happen to black Americans. Black people like to be catered to in this way. And they like for their what they believe to be their kind of cultural preferences to be catered to and pandered to. And so for someone like Martin Luther King, he's considered to be a hero. He's considered to be a leader. He's considered to be almost like a deity, quite frankly.
So if I heard that correctly, what Marx envisioned was that the church one day would be marrying two men. That they would so reject God that they would be marrying two men and affirming gay marriage. Did I read that right?
You could argue that, yeah. You could argue that. But yeah, so Marx, I mean, he was a degenerate and he was a Satanist. When you look at Marxism as a school of thought, and you see it as a kind of taking up of the baton one generation to the next, it certainly was like what King was doing was certainly within the continuation and within the tradition that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels started.
Carl Braden, the white communist that bought the home, intentionally rented it to a black family, put the family into this all-white neighborhood to stir things up. Carl Braden then bombs the home.
Right.
And so to make the allegation, look, the white racists,
white supremacy, yeah.
They did this to this black couple, and then the ultimate nail is you then show, and Carl Braden had a relationship and worked with Martin Luther King.
And so his speeches are written by Clarence Jones, a Marxist, Stanley Levison, a Marxist, Bayard Rustin, a Marxist, Jack Odell, a Marxist, and sometimes by him, also a Marxist. Like Martin Luther King, when you look at his favorability ratings, in the 60s, people had a higher view of J. Edgar Hoover than they did of Martin Luther King. Now that's important because if you look at it today, it's completely flipped. They were able to pull a fast one on us, and now we are celebrating him once a year. Martin Luther King, not only did he have all the answers, but who else could have done it?
I want to connect all the dots here. You do it in the documentary, just in this, the 1/3 of the documentary that I have seen. But I want to make sure that people listening to this conversation understand that. So what Chad is arguing about Martin Luther King Sr., his goal, Martin Luther King Jr., what he executed, there's a direct connection to Karl Marx and what his goals and Friedrich Engels and what their goals were. And so when some of it, and I hate to dumb it down to this much, but some people, they don't understand when you say Marxism, they don't understand that it's Karl Marx, that it's a political theory that comes out of the 1800s, mid-1800s, from a Jewish communist, in my view, Satanist, Karl Marx.
Right.
And he and Friedrich Engels, they are highly jealous of a Charles Spurgeon, one of the great gospel preachers, evangelists of his time, and they recognize that if the communist Marxists were going to accomplish their goal, they had to usurp authority from a Charles Spurgeon type evangelist and turn it into a social gospel type deal. And that's, again, it's like MLK is the completion of mission accomplished of what Karl Marx started in the 1840s. Tell us a little bit about Karl Marx and Charles Spurgeon and just how much they intentionally put these plans in place to disconnect Americans. And then I think Karl Marx and these guys were thinking about Americans as we moved into the 1900s. People were like, in particular, black Americans, disconnecting us from Christianity.
Yeah, and it's a long, convoluted story, and hopefully we do a good enough job in the documentary explaining exactly what you just laid out. Hopefully that reads with people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Spurgeon, the great Baptist minister, was a contemporary of Marx and Engels, but also of Charles Darwin, who popularized the theory of evolution. Now, this is important because King received what I call New Thought education when he was in school. So he was being taught Darwinian evolution, and he was also being taught, in some ways, the edicts of Marxism. And he really got that education once he went off to college. But when you look at Marx and Engels, they were trying to win over the urban poor in London. The problem, the thorn on their side, was Spurgeon, because Spurgeon was preaching the gospel. He was preaching Christ and him crucified, and he was drawing very large crowds. And this was much to the chagrin of Marx and Engels. So much so that whenever Jenny Marx, who was Karl Marx's daughter, she made this little questionnaire, and she asked she asked Engels, who is a character that you find the most detestable? And he put one word, and that word was Spurgeon. So they saw the gospel as an enemy for the work that they were trying to do. And they were trying to your point, usurp the authority of the scriptures, and they were trying to replace it with that of Marxism. Now, it's interesting because when it comes to Martin Luther, who Karl Marx studied, he believed that he gleaned a lot from Luther. He liked the fact that Luther was able to usurp authority from the Catholic Church. But what Marx said is that our movement won't stop with the taking back of authority from the church. Our secularization will take over the church and will continue on past the church. So that's what Marx envisioned. So
if I heard that correctly, what Marx envisioned was that the church one day would be marrying two men. That they would so reject God that they would be marrying two men and affirming gay marriage. Did I read that right?
You could argue that, yeah. You could argue that. But yeah, so Marx, he was a degenerate, and he was a Satanist. If you read his poems from, when he was younger, he had a lot of occult-like beliefs. But anyway, so he envisioned taking what Martin Luther did from a secular perspective and spreading it far and wide, not just within the church, but around the world. That's what he envisioned. And so it's interesting because did he perceive that there would one day be a Martin Luther King Jr.? Probably not. But again, when you look at Marxism as a school of thought and you see it as a kind of taking up of the baton one generation to the next, it certainly was like what King was doing was certainly within the continuation and within the tradition that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels started.
Check out the BYOG Bring Your Own Guitar YouTube channel and smash that subscribe button. Jeffrey Steele and I are teaming up to host musical guests for some wild interviews and performances you gotta see.
Bring your own guitar.
I'm gonna make one more sarcastic point before moving on. I can't resist it because I want the audience to connect the dots, and your documentary does a great job. But I'm trying to put the fine details on it, and just in terms of like what Karl Marx envisioned is that a church and that churchgoers and people that claim I'm a Christian. But man, I'm gonna vote for these people that want to stick tubes up a woman's vagina and slaughter a baby. But I'm still a Christian. And yes, that's child sacrifice. And yes, child sacrifice is mentioned in the Bible. And yes, God is going to punish people that harm the little children, his most precious ones. But I'm still a Christian because, there's more important things than protecting children from being slaughtered in the womb. And God's going to he's going to understand why I, look the other way on that. Karl Marx is probably the most visionary man that's maybe ever been on this planet because
that's right.
He's looking and smiling
right.
at what the church is affirming and allowing.
Right.
And what Christians think that they can allow and participate in without violating or harming their relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and we have a scene in the film where you have people like Cornel West who's saying something to the effect of, I don't want children to starve. I don't want children, as a Christian, I don't want children to starve. So how do we make sure that children are fed?
Kill them in the womb.
Well,
they won't starve if you kill them in the womb.
That's one answer. That's one. It's not the answer that Cornel West gives, but it is an answer according to a lot of what we see going on. But the answer that he gives is socialist movements. That's how you implement Christianity, is by giving way to socialist movements. And so the question the film asks is, how did we get here? Where for a lot of people, they see no difference between communism and Christianity. That's one of the biggest questions that the film seeks to answer. What's the difference? Because, leave it to Martin Luther King, there is no difference.
Well, and make sure you buckle your seatbelts. We're moving into descent, into landing the plane. We're not quite there yet, but just buckle your seatbelts up. I want to move into why this conversation about Martin Luther King is vitally important in terms of understanding what fundamental changes happened to American politics and American culture and just American norms in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement. Many people consider that a new founding of America. It's such a radical divergence from the principles that America was founded in. And so some people will, to me, will say, well, of course, this country was founded on slavery. And the fact that there was a new founding in 1964 makes perfect sense. This is better. What would you say?
Well, you're right. I mean, when you look at this guy, John Wood Jr., who's a part of Bob Woodson's 1776, which I don't know if it's still active or not, but it's, Bob Woodson, he has a diversity of characters, which I can appreciate in his 1776 Unites thing, which was a response to Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 Project. But he believes in this whole colorblind society. He would argue that Martin Luther King was the founding father of modern day America, of America 2.0. Sharing with him in this view is the likes of Tavis Smiley. The late John Lewis also believed that Martin Luther King is modern America's founding father. And they're right, unfortunately. It is an America 2.0, and it's such a deviation from what America was meant to be. Sure, the founding fathers didn't agree on a whole lot. The Convention of the States, the Constitutional Convention, was a very tumultuous thing. It wasn't something that they all just came and sung Kumbaya and then ratified the Constitution. They were vehemently in disagreement. You had the Anti-Federalists and you had the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, one of the most notable among them was Patrick Henry. And so perturbed was he by what was going on in the convention that he didn't even show up to it. And what he predicted would happen, namely the federal government imposing its will on the states, is what ended up happening. And so the fact is, when it comes to this kind of America 2.0, I would argue that it's not for the better. It's certainly not for the better. One of the things that you didn't see this in the film, in the 90 minutes that you watched, but we talk about the South before slavery, during slavery, and after slavery. We talk about the relationship between slaveholders and slaves. And the reason why we think it's necessary to address that, Jason, is because in our 21st century way of thinking, we forget the fact that slavery existed for the majority of human existence on this earth. It just did. The economy
It still does, but go ahead.
Well, it still does, but yeah, I mean, for the overwhelming majority of our presence on the earth, slavery existed. And it's hard for a lot of us to fathom in 21st century America. The economy and the way that it worked was different. You didn't have this industrial boom and this technological boom where you can work from home. and like, it was very rough and rigid, and people had to fight the elements and work with their hands and work with livestock and animals because they didn't have the machinery and things of this nature. This existed not only in America, but around the world. The reason why there was such an emphasis placed on slavery in the South, even though it existed in the North, not too long before, is because of this growing trend of Marxism. That's what it had to do with. And you can read about this in the book Letters to Americans, which is correspondence between American politicians, American Union generals, even Abraham Lincoln himself, and Marx and Engels. They were in correspondence with each other. And a lot of these so-called radical Republicans were interested in usurping in imposing themselves on the South as a kind of unfinished business left over from the Convention of States during the 1780s. And so the reason why I think that's important to bring up is because not only did you have the radical elements who were using slavery as a kind of exploitative thing to impose their will, you saw this continuing throughout Reconstruction, and you saw this continuing in A. Philip Randolph's day in the 1930s when he was the head of the National Negro Congress, and you saw this happening under Martin Luther King, using race, using exploiting these in some cases legitimate grievances to, in a sense, hand the ball off to an ever expanding federal government, because that's really what it's about. It's about expanding the role of the federal government. And when you look at when you follow the money, you follow the paperwork, you'll find that the same shadowy figures who support and fund these radical politicians are the ones who are funding these social justice movements in the streets. So they're playing on both fronts. On the one hand, they understand that in a democracy, or in our case, a constitutional republic, where the opinion of the masses matter to some degree, if you're going to impose your will, you can't just do it from the perspective of the federal government, because you have people who will cry tyranny and push back against it. However, if there's enough desire for it in the streets, now you have something going for yourself. And this is why they have an interest in supporting social justice movements. So the way, like, my approach to history is, I want to look at all sides. I want to, lift every stone and look under it, and not just take the controlled and official narrative, because oftentimes what you find is the controlled and official narrative gives way to tyranny, the same tyranny that we're supposed to be fighting. And the fact of the matter is, he who controls the narrative of the past controls the policies of the present and the conditions of the future. So the reason why we've been lied to for so long isn't just so that, they can tell the story, the history of the people they like. The reason why they tell these stories in the way that they do is because they want to control policies for the future. The reason why we have affirmative act, or no longer have affirmative action, but you wouldn't have, once again, affirmative action, DEI, and all the rest of it without the civil rights movement. And so, yes, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement is the founding father, or the kind of shifting, if you will, into America 2.0. And my question for anybody is, are we better for it? Let's take the technocracy and let's take industrialization and all of the benefits that we have gotten, which has more to do with the private sector than it does the government. But let's take all that stuff out of it. Yes, we have an ease of life in some respects, more so than our, great grandfathers. However, when it comes to the fact that we're committing more suicide, that we're more obese, that we are, just as far as just being human beings who are capable and competent, we're not better off. We're just not.
Hey everyone, be sure to visit and subscribe to the BYOG Bring Your Own Guitar YouTube channel. Join Jeffrey Steele and me as we welcome musical guests for unique interviews and performances you won't want to miss.
But bring your own guitar.
We're just not.
I think we're more nihilistic.
Exactly.
And I say that abortion is my issue. It's like if in the 1750s, 1850s, a child was a blessing.
Right.
Oh, we got more people here that's going to help us survive, and it's going to be a great asset to our family. A child's a blessing. Now a child's a burden, one that we're willing to kill at the drop of a hat. And trust me, when God finally has final say, when everybody has to hear his Supreme Court ruling, he's going to say, this child murder, I'd rather you made them slaves.
Yeah.
This is much worse.
Right.
And so what you're willing to do and what Daryl Cooper is willing to do, and Ian Carroll and a lot of these non-traditional historians, is you're willing to
Ask questions.
not just ask questions,
Yeah.
but you're willing to deal with the wrong conclusions, with the wrong truth. There's most of history and historians and the approved historians, they're all willing to reach the right conclusions. There go the bad guy. Rather than like, nah, everybody's a little bad because we're born with this sin nature when you take this biblical worldview, and people just make the best decisions that they can. And so if in the 1500s there was widespread slavery, and then you're born in 1550, and it's like why this is commonplace, widespread slavery. And then you get to 1650, and hey, slavery's still around. And you know what? We enslave white people, we enslave anybody. And then, we start doing all this sailing around and discovery, and we come across a group of people that are enslaving their own. They're selling their own into slavery. And look how primitive it is. Look how they don't even have a wheel. They don't have blah, blah, blah. I can see, and again, this isn't a conclusion you're supposed to reach.
Right.
But I could see someone saying, maybe they'd be better off being slaves.
Right.
And because it's like I saw a video in the past year where it was some people in some, I believe, African land or some undeveloped land, and they were eating ice for the first time. And they thought, you would have thought this was a miracle, and just the excitement of like they ice. And I was like, and we got people over here in America thinking we're oppressed and that we're living. I go, they're living in an undeveloped country that like time has stood still for, and they're just, someone gave them a piece of ice and they think it's a miracle from God. And so this is why, I don't know if do you know E.W. Jackson, the minister?
Yeah.
Very great orator, but he talks about like, no, I'm a black American by divine providence, that this is exactly where God wants me to be. And this is a blessing. And that's how I view it as a black American. And we're not supposed to say that.
Right.
But I'm going to say it because it's just factual.
Yeah.
I would much rather, this is the safest, most opportunity rich, longest life expectancy place on the planet for black people right here in America. I'm not going to deny that truth just so I can receive the benefits of white guilt or whatever. And so, again, we're landing the plane. We just went through some turbulence because I got us a little bit sidetracked. I want to get back to the other thing that I thought was a brilliant and subtle point in the 90 minutes that I watched. And I don't even know if it was intentional, but it's just like when you're doing great work, people can see through lines and truths. But one of the things, the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the empowerment of federal government and making the federal government more the end all be all, it helped me as I just had this like thought balloon and epiphany. It's like, well, this global one world government that they're trying to establish across the globe, they've done it to the United States. We're supposed to be a bunch of states with different cultures, different laws, different personalities. And in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the federal government became even more empowered. Power became more centralized in Washington, D.C., and the federal government becomes the ultimate authority far more than the states. And I'm like, well, what they've done to the United States is what they want to do to the world.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, one of the key components of Marxism is government owning the means of production. And that's exactly what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did, was it gave the federal government the role of dictating who a small company hires and fires and serves and don't serve. When the reality is, I would much rather a white restaurant owner have a "We don't serve Negro" sign on the door, because it lets me know, like, okay, if he was forced by the government not to have that sign on the door, will he spit in my food because he's having to serve me, and so he's doing so out of resentment? Like, I would much rather live in a society where people have the right to discriminate how they so please, irrespective of what the opinion of the federal government is. That to me sounds like a better society. Am I saying that the states should have the right to force small businesses which door to go in and which door they can't go in, as was happening? No. But the solution isn't the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The solution is maybe amending the Constitution to protect small businesses against the tyranny of either the state or the federal government. Maybe that's but again, it's a conversation that needs to be had. When you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these are legislative pieces these are decisions that were made out of sensationalism. You had demonstration going on in the streets. You had speeches that were given. You had a lot of hoaxes that were going on in the form of church bombings and house bombings, and people were reacting out of sensationalism. There wasn't a whole lot of like sophisticated, serious, good faith conversations about, okay, well, we could pass this, but is this really constitutional? And one of the few people who were willing to have that conversation was Barry Goldwater. And people rejected him. But he called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 out because of its unconstitutionality. So he was one of the people who I think was willing to have a serious conversation. But again, the media took the side of King and basically tried to move the people emotionally to be embracing of the acts. And to your point about them doing this in America in terms of getting rid of this whole notion that we are a country made up of states. You're absolutely right. You hit it right on the nose, because the reality of it is, that is what we were before the ratification of the Constitution. We had the Confederation of the States, where there were people who fought, like when it came to the Civil War, there were people who refused to join the Union because they considered themselves, no, I'm a citizen of Tennessee. No, I'm a citizen of Virginia. Like, yes, I'm an American, but I'm first and foremost a citizen of my state. And so you had this kind of honor of being a son of your state more so than being a part of this kind of federal thing. And that's notable. That to me is commendable, but we have that less and less these days. And not only that, the federal government found a way to inextricably intertwine the states into its own agenda with money, with tax dollars. So they're bribing us with our own tax dollars. You can't get this funding unless you adhere to this, or unless you adhere to that, unless you pass this law in your state legislature or pass that law in their state legislature. So they have these woke agendas, and they are requiring that the states abide and adhere to them. And if they don't, then they don't get funding. And so the states oblige, especially the ones that have weak governors. So I think that in many ways, what's going on here in the United States is kind of like a guinea pig for what they're trying to do more globally, namely get rid of borders and turn us into a globalist civilization. And it makes me very concerned for the world that my grandchildren will live in. It really does. But unless and until we stop giving way to this kind of demagoguery, allowing these, they tried to do what they did with Martin Luther King and Helen Keller and all these other activists. They tried to do it with Greta Thunberg, and you see these other kind of people that they are trying to give us the impression that they are some kind of hero. I don't think it's as effective these days as it was in the 60s and before then. And perhaps it's because of the fact that everybody has, like, the public square is more saturated these days than it was in those days, where you have people kind of rising to notoriety with nothing but a camera and a computer, who are able to podcast and who are able to start YouTube channels. So you have a lot of diversity of opinion that's going on, such to where it's difficult to really push and promote artificially a singular person as the one who has all the answers, who will, is speaking truth to power, such as you were. And so this is why, like Greta Thunberg, she went from being a manufactured hero to a meme, because people don't fall for it anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the shadowy figures have given up. They're just coming up with different ways to do it. And we as Christians especially have to be as gentle as doves, but as wise as serpents. And I fear that, unfortunately, many churches are giving way to this demagoguery and to this trickery, and we don't have discernment anymore, and it's a problem.
Are you optimistic?
I'm white-pilled, yes. I'm not black-pilled. I'm not someone who believes that, it's all going to burn, let's just let it all burn down. I believe that Christ still sits on the throne. I believe that he alone has the words of eternal life. And I believe that we, as his remnant, have a great commission to preach Christ and him crucified. That doesn't mean that we disengage from the culture. I think we address what's going on in the culture. But then, too, it's on us to be the salt and the light. And so, yes, I am optimistic insofar that I believe that I have something. Like I found that pearl in the forest, and I want to share that with other people who are willing to listen to it. So for me, like, part of the reason why it's important to make a documentary about MLK is because MLK was an apostate. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He preached something that pretended to be the gospel but wasn't the gospel at all. And I have a concern that many people believe his idea of what the gospel is. And so it's necessary to warn you that, no, that's not the gospel at all. The social gospel is not the gospel. And it's necessary to then find out, okay, well, what is a true gospel? Well, what does that mean? And my hope is that people will turn to Christ and worship God and not men. Like, we need to stop putting men on pedestals. I don't care who that man is. One of my favorite forefathers, or I guess American founding fathers, is Patrick Henry for many reasons, but I'm not even going to put him on a pedestal. I'm going to acknowledge his wisdom. I'm going to acknowledge how he had things more right than some of the other founding fathers, but I'm not going to worship the man, or, you know what I mean? You acknowledge his faults, and the fact is some had more faults than others. But this whole idea of, like, I mean, it violates the very first commandment. I am the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt. You shall have no other God before me. And many of us, we want so badly for some party or for some politician or for some historical figure to be the person who we follow. We want so badly to be led. And to the point that you so eloquently made earlier, let Christ lead you. It's really that simple. Let Christ lead you. But the reality of it is, we want so badly for somebody to be the enemy. We want so badly for somebody to be the hero. If you're a Republican, you want it to be the Democrats. It's like, as somebody who studies history, you realize there were great Democrats historically. There were great Republicans historically. There were terrible Republicans historically, especially in the 1860s. And you realize that history is not very partisan. It's just not. And of course, like, the modern iteration of the Republicans are far better than the modern iteration of the Democrats. That goes without saying. But to the extent that you kind of cluster yourself into this Republican good, Democrat bad, you miss a whole lot. And so, again, many of us want for somebody to be the enemy. Well, what happens if you make Biden the enemy and Biden loses the election? Then who now is the enemy? That doesn't mean that you don't engage politically. That doesn't mean that you don't vote. You just are aware that my battle is not against flesh and blood. It's a much deeper and bigger war going on. And there's literally Satan who wishes to steal, kill, and destroy us. And so we had better pay attention to who the real hero is, which is Christ, and who the real villain is, which is Satan.
I'm trying to get into an optimistic place, and part of what is getting me there is that I do think we're landing the plane. The plane is landed. We're taxiing into the runway, actually. But I'm going to go all the way back to where we started, talking about Kevin Samuels, kind of the manosphere. I do think what makes me a tiny bit optimistic is that men are starting to realize that maybe we need to align more. And it can't be a skin color thing. It has to be a male leadership thing. There's a ruggedness to conversation that has to happen in order for truth to prevail. This entire conversation we just had here, I think men will enjoy it and understand it more. Women want people to be more comfortable. They don't want to say things. They don't want to acknowledge truths that are really uncomfortable, that yes, slavery was bad, but maybe it made a little bit of sense then. And then not just that it made sense, but that, wow, look at America. They had such biblical values. They wrote a Constitution and a Bill of Rights that upended and uprooted slavery and allowed a biblical worldview to prevail as it relates to ending any sort of racialized slavery. But I think only men can have the kind of conversations that will uproot this mentality, this Marxist mentality that has taken root and has destroyed the church and has led to all these false gospels and false prophets. And I think your documentary here, the MLK Project, I think could end up being a very important voice and lead to a very important conversation. Hats off to you, Chad, for taking on the project, for doing it at such a high level, for going after a real icon where there's risks. I mean, people are going to be very upset about you and this documentary and the truth that you're exposing. But I want to support it. I want to thank you for coming to Nashville and spending the time with me to have this conversation and to show me a nice little good chunk of the MLK Project.
Help us grow the Fearless Army. Pound that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with all your fearless friends.